U.S. China tensions have never been higher, but bipartisan support for tough action on China means there's more to come. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. So, I know there's been a lot going on, so I can understand that you might not be paying that much attention to U.S. foreign policy right now. But it's pretty clear the U.S. and China are pretty much in Cold War II. Actually, China has been in Cold War II for years, and now the U.S. is finally catching on. And now that they have caught on, here are 7 ways the U.S. government is ramping up the pressure on China. Number 7, calling out the Chinese Communist Party. Did you know the FBI opens a new counterintelligence case on China every 10 hours? That was a pretty big revelation from FBI Director Christopher Wray this month at a speech at the Hudson Institute. But he went further, calling China the greatest long-term threat to the U.S.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. It's a threat to our economic security and, by extension, to our national security.
Wray also did an interesting thing in his speech. He specifically called out the Chinese Communist Party.
This is not about the Chinese people, and it's certainly not about Chinese Americans. Every year, the United States welcomes more than 100,000 Chinese students and researchers into this country. For generations, people have journeyed from China to the United States to secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their families. And our society is better for their contributions. So when I speak of the threat from China, I mean the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party.
Now, we've been calling out the Chinese Communist Party for years on our other show, China Uncensored. So I'm happy to see the U.S. government is finally following our lead, which is what I'm assuming happened. And I will not be fact-checking that. But the FBI director's speech wasn't just a one-off thing. It's part of a series of speeches on the threat of the Chinese Communist Party, starting last month with National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, who was even more direct.
The Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist organization. The party General Secretary Xi Jinping sees himself as Joseph Stalin's successor.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Did he just compare Xi Jinping to Stalin? That's a little unfair. Young Stalin was way more handsome. I mean, young Xi Jinping was no troll, but let's be honest. At the Communist Party, Stalin gets all the girls. And probably some of the guys. Now, for decades, the U.S. believed that China would become more free if we engaged with them and did more business with them. O'Brien called this the worst American foreign policy failure since the 1930s. And he said it happened because we didn't understand the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party.
Instead of listening to what CCP leaders were saying, instead of reading what they wrote in their key documents, we closed our eyes and our ears. We believed what we wanted to believe, that these party members were communist in name only.
Look, just because communist officials are rich and corrupt, that doesn't mean they're not communists. It just means they're also hypocrites. Now, these speeches came after the Trump administration released a document laying out the United States' strategic approach to the People's Republic of China. It's worth a read. But this isn't just all talk and no action. The U.S. is putting pressure on China where it hurts, economically. Which leads us to number 6, decoupling economies. The idea the U.S. should decouple its economy from China has been around for a while. But it seemed like with President Trump's insistence on the biggest trade deal ever seen, that wasn't going to happen. But that was January, when we were all so much more fresh-faced and optimistic about 2020. Halfway through the year, things are looking a little different, and talk of decoupling is back.
America's top trade negotiator, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, on Wednesday told Congress he did not think it would be possible to, quote, decouple the economies of the two countries. Trump contradicted Lighthizer in a tweet Thursday, writing, quote, "The U.S. certainly does maintain a policy option under various conditions of a complete decoupling from China."
Even Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, who's known for being softer on China, has said that decoupling will actually happen if U.S. firms can't compete fairly in China. U.S. firms being treated fairly in China. I wouldn't hold my breath for that one. Which means that U.S. companies should prepare for the U.S. and China to decouple. Of course, decoupling isn't easy. Japan is actually giving money to companies to pull out of China. The U.S. isn't going that far yet, but there could be more government actions to help. According to government officials, tax incentives and potential reshoring subsidies are among measures being considered to spur changes. I could do an entire episode on what decoupling would mean for the U.S. economy, but that's not this episode. However, a related issue is number 5, targeting Chinese companies for security issues. Chinese apps like TikTok and WeChat have long been a security concern. Recently, India banned almost 60 of them. The US is now hinting at that too.
The US government is looking into allegations TikTok violated children's privacy. On Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the United States was certainly looking at banning the app. He suggested it shared information with the Chinese government. TikTok denied the accusation. Any potential ban would be a heavy blow for TikTok. It said last year that 60% of its 26 million monthly active users in the US are aged 16 to 24. US lawmakers have also raised national security concerns over TikTok's handling of user data.
I guess my dream of becoming a TikTok star may never come true. But it's not just TikTok the US is worried about. The Pentagon recently released a list of Chinese companies that have ties to the People's Liberation Army. That's the Chinese Communist Party's military. Yes, in China, the military belongs to the party, not the government. And one of those companies is the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei. Leave a comment if you're watching this episode on a Huawei phone. The US government has considered Huawei a security threat since the Obama administration. It's one of the several things that Trump and Obama agree on. Besides blacklisting Huawei in the US, the Trump administration is also trying to convince allies that they should cut ties with Huawei, which is just one of the ways the US is doing number 4, working with allies to pressure China. Chinese state-run media want you to believe that challenging China is something that only a lonely loser like America would do. And American mainstream media want you to believe that the US is isolating itself and refusing to lead. But when it comes to China, neither is true. The US government is building coalitions to pressure the Chinese Communist Party. From the Five Eyes countries of the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to Asian allies like South Korea and Japan. Although this isn't just because of US leadership. A lot of it has to do with the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, which, once again, is bringing the world together. But the US is taking advantage of that to press its case, by doing things like creating an economic prosperity network of trade partners, and working with allies to create an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien is even traveling to Europe this week for talks on China. Speaking of security issues, number 3, selling missiles to Taiwan. The US has just approved $620 million in missile upgrades for Taiwan. That feeling you get when you have no official diplomatic ties with the country, but still sell them weapons. Of course, the editor-in-chief of my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, had this to say on Twitter, which is banned in China. PLA is fully capable of destroying all of Taiwan's military installations within a few hours, before seizing the island shortly after. Chinese army and people have such self-confidence. At the same time, we strongly support maintaining peace. Sparking a conflict should be avoided. Yes, clearly they strongly support maintaining peace. But I don't know why they're upset. From the Communist Party's point of view, Taiwan is China. So it's like the U.S. gave China $620 million worth of missile upgrades. Anyway, let's just hope Cold War II doesn't turn into World War III. But it's not just U.S. military support for Taiwan. U.S.-Taiwan relations haven't been this good since Chiang Kai-shek. Taiwan is reopening its consulate on Guam. U.S. lawmakers have proposed the bipartisan Taiwan Fellowship Act, which would create a program for U.S. government employees to live and work in Taiwan. And one U.S. lawmaker, Congressman Michael McCaul, has suggested that the U.S. could give Taiwan full diplomatic recognition. The Chinese Communist Party hates this idea, possibly more than they hate number 2, punishing Chinese officials for human rights violations. Remember the days when it was cool for Hollywood to stand up for Tibet? Even though you'll never see Hollywood criticizing the Chinese Communist Party today, the U.S. government is making up for it, particularly Mike Pompeo. Not quite the same as Richard Gere. The Chinese Communist Party has banned foreigners from traveling to Tibet. So now Pompeo announced the U.S. will put travel bans on Chinese officials responsible for the Tibet travel ban. Of course, Chinese officials then just put a travel ban on U.S. officials, putting a travel ban on Chinese officials, putting on a travel ban to Tibet. Then again, the Chinese Communist Party put the whole world on a travel ban because of the coronavirus. But the U.S. government isn't just targeting Chinese officials for their human rights violations in Tibet. The Uyghurs are a predominantly Muslim ethnic group in northwest China. But not for long if the Communist Party has anything to say about it. 1 to 2 million Uyghurs have been put in concentration camps. If you want to know all the gory details about what goes on in those camps, check out our recent interview with a Uyghur activist on the China Unscripted podcast. But to give you just a taste, 13 tons of hair from Uyghur prisoners was seized by U.S. Customs on a shipment from China. Last month, Congress passed the bipartisan Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which Trump signed into law. And now, the U.S. is imposing sanctions on Chinese officials involved in persecuting the Uyghurs.
Washington blacklisted Xinjiang's Communist Party Secretary Chen Chuan-kuo, a member of China's powerful Politburo, and 3 other officials. Chen is widely considered the senior official responsible for the security crackdown in Xinjiang, where United Nations experts and activists estimate more than 1 million Muslims have been detained in camps. The U.S. sanctions were imposed under the Global Magnitsky Act. The act allows the U.S. government to target human rights violators worldwide by freezing any U.S. assets, banning U.S. travel, and prohibiting Americans from doing business with them.
And could there be any greater punishment than denying someone America? And finally, number 1, defending Hong Kong. For more than a year now, Hong Kongers have been protesting the authoritarian regime of the Chinese Communist Party. And they know how to get Trump's attention. But things have gotten way worse since Beijing passed a new national security law. Here are protesters being harassed by police for holding blank sheets of paper. I thought the national security law would make criticizing the Communist Party illegal. Turns out, not criticizing the party is illegal too. The national security law even applies to people overseas. So basically, anyone in the world could be guilty of violating the national security law. Like Pompeo after saying this.
Free Hong Kong was one of the world's most stable, prosperous, and dynamic cities. Now it will be just another communist-run city where its people will be subject to the party elite's whims.
I'd recommend not traveling to Hong Kong anytime soon. But Congress unanimously passed and Trump signed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and that hits hard.
We recently announced visa measures against Chinese officials responsible for undermining Hong Kong's autonomy. We will also be changing the way we handle exports of defense material and sensitive technology to Hong Kong. Other measures are under review in a process led by the White House.
What other measures? Well, let's just say there are some nuclear options. Okay, not actual nukes. Nukes are good if you need to restart the sun or the Earth's core, but not for saving Hong Kong. Essentially what this would mean is this. The Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. could potentially limit Hong Kong banks' ability to buy U.S. dollars, and then the Hong Kong economy kind of implodes, which would really hurt Chinese Communist Party members who tend to be the wealthy elite. More than half of Hong Kong's estimated private wealth of more than $1 trillion comes from mainland individuals. Of course, disrupting the dollar peg would also be bad for Hong Kong and the U.S., so it's not the most likely option. But the U.S. government's policy toward Hong Kong is a good example of their new approach to the Chinese Communist Party. According to their strategic approach document, when quiet diplomacy proves futile, the United States will increase public pressure on the Chinese government and take action to protect United States interests by leveraging proportional costs when necessary. Basically, the U.S. government said they were going to respond, and then they did. So it's clear the U.S. government is really putting pressure on the Chinese Communist Party. And now it's election season, which means who can be tougher on China will be a major campaign issue. Joe Biden criticizes Trump for being too soft on China. Trump accuses Biden of being too soft on China, and Xi Jinping sweats a little more. And of course, if you want to stay up to date on the latest China news, be sure to subscribe to my other channel, China Uncensored. Before I go, I just want to give a big shout out to all of you who support this show on Patreon. With YouTube demonetizing us so much, we'd have to shut down the show. But your support keeps us going. Visit patreon.com/America Uncovered to find out how you can help us keep America uncovered. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.